Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Port Jackson Securities webinar. Obviously, you've got the host Lachlan today. We're joined by our Managing Director from Elixir Energy, Neil Young. Neil, thank you once again for coming back.
No, pleased to do so. And I gather there's a reasonable audience today, which probably implies that everyone's stuck at home with COVID, or maybe they're even interested in the stock.
Yeah, more interested, I believe. I don't. Hopefully, not too many people have COVID out there, but right now it's been very interesting in the market, and obviously people are very interested to see how things have been going. But obviously, over the last year, you've had a pretty crazy year with a lot of drills being done, a lot of completions being done. How did you find last year, and is anything to take forward into this year?
Yeah, well, certainly last year was a time of great ups and downs. At the start of the year, we just closed out a bunch of listed options being exercised, which put our balance sheets in a good position. And then a number of months later, we strengthened the balance sheet even more with a successful placement and SPP. And our balance sheet remains very, very strong just now, which allows us to ride out what we hope are the temporary slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in the market just now. And it's a very good position to be in. Operationally, we faced numerous issues with COVID, but ultimately I managed to get back to Mongolia for the first time in nearly 2 years in November. Then had to scarper quick when Omicron broke, but now that that's peaking, I'm looking to go back next month. Drilling, we did a bit short of 20 wells last year, which we think is pretty good for our peer group. Not every well works, that's the nature of exploration. But we discovered a number of new coal-bearing subbasins in the window that we're looking for coal seam gas. And I think the single standout well was one that we called Nomgon 6, which flowed fluids to surface for the first time in the country's gas history, and flowed at rates which we found very encouraging, and gave us the data to allow us to set up a extended pilot production test in 2022, which I'll talk more about. I've got a presentation coming up after this. Other highlight was we developed our hydrogen strategy for the country, which we've now renamed the Gobi H2 Project. Yep. I think I first mentioned this publicly a couple of years ago, but the momentum really built up last year, and it's something that we're incredibly excited about. The more work we do, the more we like it. And indeed, I've been so bold as to say that in my personal view, I think it's one of the globally best hydrogen export projects that I've seen, and I've pretty much looked at most of them. So hopefully others will share that view as we mature Gobi H2.
Beautiful, beautiful. I've got a nitpick now. I'm interested to see why that's going to be your view. But as always, audience, we've got questions at the end with Neil. You've got a little tab drop-down box. If you want to put in your questions, we'll just save those for the end, and then we'll answer them live here today. But as you said, we've got a presentation to get through with regards to the future of EXR and where we're going to be leading into. This isn't any advice. This is all just for research purposes. So obviously, with regards to today's presentation, we'll just take that on board. But if everyone sees the screen, I'm happy to continue on if you want to get going.
Yeah, thanks, Lachlan. Now, it's a good job we're not a tech company, because I'm getting Lachlan to press the button here, but hopefully that's forgivable in an energy stock. So we've just posted this presentation on the ASX, and I'll just run through it just now, and then look forward to an interactive session at the end of that. So I haven't reintroduced the company in this presentation. I'm assuming that this audience is fairly self-selected and knows something about us, but I'll just verbally mention that I'm the managing director. My name's Neil Young. I first went to Mongolia more than 10 years ago with a view to trying to develop a coal seam gas or coal bed methane business in that country. And why did I do that? Well, I suppose it was because It was immediately adjacent to China, which at that stage was starting to consider importing coal seam gas from Queensland, which it now does in large volumes. And I thought, well, if that makes sense economically, Mongolia, which has got a lot of coal, will have very significant locational advantages in terms of avoiding the whole costs of shipping gas all the way from Australia. And that thesis is now even more playing out in hydrogen, but I'll come back to that. Also on our board is our chairman, Richard Cottee, who was the managing director of Queensland Gas Co, which is now supplying coal seam gas to China under the ownership of Shell and CNOOC, the Chinese national oil company. Also joining us on the team is another coal seam gas expert, an ex-colleague of mine from Santos. About 15 years ago, he set up Santos's coal seam gas business. His name is Stephen Kellerman, and he's a global expert on the topic. Our most recently appointed director is a lady originally from Belarus, the other end of the ex-Soviet empire, from Mongolia, a fluent Russian speaker, has worked in China, and really brings a lot of insights for me as to how ex-Soviet countries are governed, which are not perfect, but are certainly a lot better than many in my experience. So that's Elixir. I'll go to the highlights here of the forward-looking program for this year. So we've done a lot of work in previous years. Every year we've done more work. As I noted, last year we drilled nearly 20 wells. This year will be 22 wells and an extended production test. That test involves completing 2 wells, putting them on pump, and then pumping out fluid for a period of up to 6 months, which will initially be water and then ultimately gas. And if that gas flows at a commercial flow rate, then we'll be able to book our initial reserves booking for this asset. In parallel to that pilot test, we'll be drilling wells all across the PSC area, which for those of you who've heard me before, I liken to a piece of land the size of Belgium. It's 30,000 square kilometers. It's a pretty big piece of real estate. We'll be shooting seismic, as we've done in previous years as well, and building up a whole bunch of data on what we look forward to being new coal-bearing subbasins. I mentioned cash. This is strong. It's nearly $30 million as at the end of the year. This finances us for a number of years to come. Coal seam gas drilling is cheap compared to normal oil and gas, and Mongolia is cheaper than Australia by a fairly long way. Our well costs are in the hundreds of thousands, not in the millions. Now, our hydrogen project, we are the first mover in the country. I'm aware of some other larger companies sniffing around, and indeed they might be interesting people to talk with and potentially partner with in the future. But as right now, we are moving rather than just thinking about it, and that's gaining us a number of material advantages. And the foundation of those advantages is location. If it's meritorious to supply methane from Mongolia to China, then hydrogen is even much more advantaged given the physics of moving it, and I'll come back to that point. And then hydrogen in its green form is made from renewable electrical energy, and Mongolia has fabulous wind and solar resources, which we are measuring just now, and we towards the end of last year acquired a pre-development solar farm asset as well. All right, thanks. Okay, so here's a summary of the 2021 program that was undertaken. You see the map there. That's the PSC area in the map indented. It's just on the Mongolian border, just north of China. In the middle of our block, you can see a bit of a rectangle. That is a mine called Tavantolgoy, which is a world-class coal mine. And more recently, an ASX company has farmed into there to explore for coal seam gas like us. And it, in fact, has a number of peers who've joined us on the coal seam gas journey in Mongolia, which we thoroughly welcome. Our view is the more the merrier, the more interest it attracts. And certainly the history of Queensland coal seam gas was that as more players came in, it attracted more interest from others over a number of years. So focusing on the detail of the work, we drilled 17 wells. We undertook one short-term pilot production test. We interpreted all those well results. The wells were categorized into core holes and lower cost stratigraphic holes. Seismic, we shot more than 500 kilometers, and we reinterpreted seismic that we'd shot in previous years, and that all feeds into an inventory of wells which we're going to drill in 2022. In the area of our initial discovery in the Nongon subbasin, we have been progressing a coal-fired generation project. We've executed an MOU with Mongolia's Ministry of Energy regarding that. That will be about 5 megawatts in size, reflecting the size of the current transmission network immediately proximate to that particular asset. But we see if that being successful, then other and larger gas-fired projects could take place. And maybe a good point to mention that many of you might have seen that Rio Tinto struck a deal with the Mongolian government this week to advance the underground stage of its massive Oyu Tolgoi mine, which on this map is just in the southeast corner, that little square there. And as part of that deal, Rio has committed to buy power from the Mongolian grid. Now, the problem is the Mongolian grid doesn't have spare power just now, so the government will be looking to encourage new sources of power, be they coal-fired, gas-fired, renewables, and hence a fertile environment in new demand, basically requiring to be served from indigenous sources. We undertake field work in terms of expeditions and then a lot of lab work in Mongolia, in Australia, and also occasionally using experts in the UK for paleontology, for example, or Beijing from time to time. There's a list of things there. I'm not the technical guru, so I will take that as read and move to the next slide. So managing COVID, globally, it has been a ubiquitous phenomenon. Mongolia is a developing nation, but it's been fairly blessed in terms of it managed to obtain a lot of vaccines early. And so now the population is strongly vaccinated with some weaknesses because of the early use of Chinese vaccines, but overall dealing with Omicron now reasonably effectively with the borders reopening again. Last year, there were constant changes as internal borders came up and down, and certainly externally, it was very difficult to get into the country until later in the year. But our team has been excellent in dealing with that. We have a strong local team headed by people I've known for a considerable period, and we think it important to invest in the staff capabilities in a country in which we invest, and we've increasingly done that. The Ministry of Mining recognized our efforts for the second year in a row in managing these COVID challenges by awarding us a prize called the Best Investor of 2021. And although that seems facile in some ways, it is important in a foreign country to have strong relationships, and we believe that we invest a lot into that, which is appropriate, and we're duly rewarded for doing so. In 2022, borders are more open, but the biggest issue that we might face is how long the Chinese borders remain very tight. Most of you will know that the Chinese government has, in effect, locked down the country for 2 years and will likely do so for a longer period. Getting supplies from China is accordingly delayed, but we are putting in place mechanisms to deal with that, such as ordering long lead items already, which are winging their way to Mongolia, but we are recognized could take a number of months as those Chinese border issues play out. Otherwise, in 2021, we had no safety or environmental issues. We look after the local communities that we work in. Anybody who's seen, for instance, Santos entering in New South Wales, which I was involved in back in 2007, are still twiddling their thumbs after spending $2 billion later. So you better work with local people on gas projects, or they can cause you problems, and that's something we've invested in right from the start. Okay. So the 2022 program, here we see a bunch of targets in various sub-basins that we've identified through seismic and prior drilling work. The centerpiece of these will be towards the middle of the year, the extended pilot production tests, which I'll come back to, 22 exploration and appraisal wells, and potentially another short-term pilot production test as we did in 21. 300 Ks plus of 2D seismic and more seismic reinterpretation. That's a moving feast. And then as we hopefully obtain success in our extended production test, that will feed through in parallel to the generation project. Proving commerciality of the subsurface will work hand in glove with doing feasibility work on the surface work, which will entail a gas engine-based project connected to the local grid. And then, of course, we'll follow up more field work as we always do. So the extended pilot production test, here's a schematic of the surface facilities. Now, what's the aim of this? It's to dewater the coals and flow gas from the discovery that we made in the Nomgon sub-basin and provide proof of concept for a commercial development, which, as we've said, is a gas-fired generation one in this locale. Now, we've designed this to have two production wells 100 meters apart, depth to coals about 450 meters. This is not far from some prior wells that we've drilled, most of which were plugged and abandoned in accordance with the required practices, but a couple of which have been retained now as pressure monitoring wells to feed into the data that we will gather from this process. Under Mongolian law, a production test should be for 6 months maximum, and we aim to start that in the middle of the year. I don't want to sort of overpromise on that because of issues such as, I say, the unpredictability of Chinese border controls, but we're solidly aiming for that. Ultimately, obviously, we want to have the ASX favourite of photos of a flare here and flow rates of gas which are commercial, and commercial here will rest upon the cost of drilling. Commerciality is entirely dependent upon your expected development costs, and so therefore different flow rates in different locations can be supportive of commerciality. And because costs here are low, accordingly a commercial breakthrough point can also be low. But I don't really want to go into at this point about delivering a number, because otherwise people will seize on it probably with rather too much emphasis. Okay. So here's the timetable for the year. A number of things go on throughout the year. We need to deal with the regulators, which are both petroleum, environmental, and local governments. We invest in the community. We provided support through COVID. We help out people with water wells. It's a pretty dry location, and work closely with the equivalent of the local mayors in the locations in which we are at. We do a lot of technical work using experts in Australia, which is now the global coal seam gas centre of excellence. And increasingly, we're adding to that with a trained up Mongolian workforce. The seismic process will commence in Q2 and run for a couple of quarters. Drilling will commence in this quarter. Now, there is an annual approval process required for drilling, and that requires the petroleum regulator, then the Environment Ministry, to issue annual permits. But we've got a couple of permits left over from last year, and we aim to drill a couple of wells starting next month. Then we'll be drilling pretty much for the rest of the year, as we did in 2021 in various locations. We're going through a mandatory tender process just now, which is near finalization. We anticipate hiring 3 different drilling companies to do different types of work. And we look forward to a competition working well, as it did for us last year when we had 2 drilling companies, and also being able to learn from what the other operators are doing. And one of the benefits, as I mentioned, of an increased presence in the sector is that it effectively then induces a bigger and better service sector. So now, when I was in Ulaanbaatar in November, met a drilling company. They've imported 2 new rigs, which are capable of drilling to deeper depths, and those have been deployed recently for some others. And so we already see coming to fruition a broader sector delivering benefits to all. Production testing, we're aiming to start at the end of Q2 and then keep going for a number of months after that. And let's see how that plays out. So that's the timetable for the year, full of activity as it has been in previous years, and something that will generate lots of news flow. Of course, I say not every well will be a winner, although obviously the market would prefer that to be the case, but that's not how the geology gods play. And but we think our strike rate achieved to date has been pretty decent. So here we illustrate how our work program has expanded over the years. I came up with a rather tired phrase, well, certainly I'm tired of saying it, of the rinse and repeat model, and that is just doing what we do, moving out to new basins, doing appraisal work, doing the short-term production test, and now the longer-term production test. In 2019, we started with 4 wells. We nearly doubled that in 2020. Then we trebled it in 2021, and now we're doing more, including these production tests in 2022. We think this is an aggressive but measured expansion approach, and it's all been managed over the last 2 years with COVID. With expats pretty much not being able to go to the country, which has allowed us to, for instance, develop models which we'll use in the future of supervising testing using online methods rather than shipping people out at greater expense to a country. And so in some ways, COVID has helped us develop new tools like that.
So it has made you quite efficient during that period of time, do you find?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and I suppose I mentioned bringing on the local workforce as being important, and that's something that has had to happen, and not only our workforce but the subcontractor workforce, and then our Australian experts have had to liaise with the locals using online tools, and that's been not only our own geologists, etc., but also the service sector people that we've employed in Australia. And thankfully, Mongolia is pretty much in the same time zone as us. And with modern communications, we can use Zoom type tools to supervise things with video as well as audio, even though we're in the middle of the famous Gobi Desert. So that's been pretty interesting to see. And to manage things without the expense of foreigners is not only a cost saving, but it demonstrates to the local regulators and communities that we're not just some foreigners coming out here and bossing everyone around, which is an important part of building our social license. Okay. So moving to Gobi H2, here's the map that contextualizes where our petroleum license is. Now, that license has got no impact on our hydrogen project other than that is where we work. That is where we know the regional government, we know the local government, we know the local people, we have people employed here, we do work here. And those relationships which are relevant for one resources business are also relevant for a new one. Some people have said, "Oh, what's this crap about moving from methane to hydrogen?" Excuse my language. surely the two aren't compatible. Well, I think dealing with stakeholders, dealing with communities, dealing with the governments are compatible, and they provide a very strong platform for us to have launched this first mover advantage. Here we see China, and its most adjacent province to Mongolia is Inner Mongolia. That province produces a lot of steel, certainly a lot more steel than Australia does. And for instance, the city of Baotao, which I point to here on the map, hosts significant steel production, and that is not that far away. It's a few hundred kilometers by road from the areas at which we are looking to potentially produce green hydrogen using Mongolia's renewable resources. If something can be delivered by road, that is a short-term vision. The longer-term vision is delivered by pipeline, and that is the key source of competitive advantage for Gobi H2, is being able to deliver by pipeline saves an enormous amount of money compared to rivals in the likes of Australia, Chile, Namibia, which would have to deliver 2 projects by boat, which is enormously more expensive, which I happen to illustrate on the next slide. So here's a graph which I commissioned from an international energy consulting outfit called Rystad Energy. And what it really shows in gigajoules, the classic unit of measurement under which methane is sold. People often talk about hydrogen in kilograms, but I think that's misleading. It's an energy product, and it's best compared by expressing it in energy terms. Now, what this shows is that shipping by boat, by liquefying hydrogen and delivering to East Asian markets, is going to cost in the region of $20 a gigajoule just for the shipping and liquefaction costs. Now, to compare that to methane, that costs about $5 a gigajoule to liquefy and ship, so it's about 4 times more expensive. Now, moving by pipeline, depending on distance here, the cost is going to be $1 or $2 if we're shipping 300-400 Ks. So in effect, 10% of the cost of shipping. So that's one thing. Now, someone might say, but surely Australia's got better sun, so won't that compensate for the shipping costs? Well, the cost of producing hydrogen before you actually ship it, 2/3 of that are how good your renewables are. 1/3 is basically the rest, which is the cost of your electrolyzer, your water, your labor, etc. So it's really all about renewables, and it's all about delivery. Everything else is noise. Now, the renewables in Mongolia, and we published something on this on the ASX, are fabulous. And the comparative studies that we commissioned from an independent expert indicated that when combining wind and solar, and it's the combination is important because obviously it doesn't, it's not sunny at night and it's not always windy. Mongolia is pretty much as good as anywhere we could find in Australia. So that's high quality resource. Combined with that, approximately $18 a gigajoule delivery advantage means that in my view, and I probably have to express it this way, in my view, I haven't come across a better hydrogen export project. That begs a question, though, well, why will it need to import hydrogen? Surely it can produce its own. Well, I mean, China is the world's largest oil importer, becoming the world's largest gas importer. It's a coal importer, as we in Australia know, and it is the world, in totality, the world's largest energy importer. More recently, we've commissioned another study by Rystad independently, which analyzes China's likely hydrogen needs in the decades to come, and which concludes that it will become a major hydrogen importer. And that being the case, there is no other location better than Mongolia near to China's industrial sectors on the East Coast. So we think it's a fabulous advantage, and we're pursuing it now very, very hard. Okay, next slide. So, as I mentioned, we combine exceptional renewable resources and a market that can be reached by pipeline, not boat. We believe that makes us tier 1 globally. Now, we're engaging with multiple stakeholders to push this hard. We've got a lot of support from inside the country. That's been reflected, for instance, with an MOU that we entered into with the Ministry of Energy. We've done work under that to provide it with legal advice from both Australia and Mongolia, which basically concludes the existing law is adequate. You don't need to do anything and wait for that. We have a feasibility study underway using Australian expert engineers who've done similar projects here recently. We're targeting Chinese steel mills, and we haven't engaged them yet because we want to do so later this year once we have the feasibility study more mature. But they are the most logical, but not only market for hydrogen. Steel is certainly one of the best markets for that product in our view. Now, we've got a good balance sheet, but we naturally don't want to spend it. So we've been engaging with potential project financiers for a pilot project. And in Mongolia, that has been led by a quasi-government body called the Mongolia Green Finance Corporation, who I signed another MOU with recently. And also, we've engaged with the Asian Development Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, both of whom have significant presences in Mongolia and have mandates these days, which mean that they want to finance projects such as green hydrogen, and they don't want to finance things like coal. So we've very much got an open door with those parties, and we see that the possibility of project finance for a pilot is high. Now, the key physical ingredient for green hydrogen that the electricity is basically applied to is water. There is water in the Gobi Desert. To give a sense of context for that, Rio Tinto's Oyu Tolgoi mine ultimately will use 1 ton a second of water. I visited the water infrastructure that they've got there. It's pretty significant, and it obtains groundwater from 50, 100 meters deep in the desert. There are substantial water resources available there that can underwrite very, very large hydrogen projects. So water is available. We'll be drilling for some this year to feed the pilot, and ultimately to feed a much larger project that we think can emerge in the decades to come after that.
That's
now,
excellent.
Sorry.
That's excellent. That's really good to hear.
No worries. And then we are measuring the wind resources and solar resources in the region. We imported a piece of equipment from Australia called a SODAR, made by an Australian company here called Fulcrum, who I've known for a few years. And this piece of equipment is very robust, designed for Australian conditions to measure wind and sun in a bankable fashion. To date, the results we've got that in the 6 months or so that we've deployed it have been very encouraging, and we'll report more on that in due course. We're importing a solar-specific tool also from Fulcrum to deploy on the pre-development solar project that we acquired, which is proximate to the Oyu Tolgoi mine that I mentioned. And we're now in the process of importing more of these assets to deploy here. The key on these things is that until you start measuring, you haven't got something bankable. So it's about time rather than money. And again, this goes to our first mover advantage here. Solar and wind here is really complementary, really strong, and we think would underwrite a great project. Okay. So here's the investment highlights for Elixir. We're first mover in CSG in Mongolia. That's now attracting wider interest. There are now basically 4 ASX companies doing similar things, and we absolutely welcome that, and we wish them the best of success, because if that happens across the board, then that brings in more and more interest and significant ancillary benefits, as I mentioned, such as a growing service sector. Our program in 2022 is again expanding upon the programs in the prior 3 years. We're looking to add new resources, and we're looking to de-risk discovered resources, with a primary tool for doing that being the extended pilot production test, which, if that goes to plan, will deliver a commercial gas flow rate and allow a gas-fired generation project, the first in the country, to move ahead. Now, we've got a very strong balance sheet, as you've heard me mention maybe more than once or twice today. We have a 100% asset ownership position. Now, both of those things give us strategic and tactical optionality. We don't need to deal with anybody else. I mean, our view is that in the success case, a large asset needs a large developer, but as and when we bring in any such party, it's up to us. We don't have to do it because of balance sheet or other constraints. Now, within the country, we think we've got some pretty good relationships. I'm a board member of the Mongolian Business Council and recently became deputy chairman of a new body set up called the Mongolian Hydrogen Council. We have a great local team which we've expanded over the course of this year, and we've got growing service sector support, which is growing in skills and in equipment inside the country. Now, the gas market globally over the last 6 months or so has been unbelievably fabulous for a gas seller, but not for a gas buyer. Prices in East Asia and Europe have for months been $30 a gigajoule or an MMBTU, just unheard of prices. I mean, higher than oil price equivalent, which virtually never ever happens. I mean, prices in Australia have been solid, not quite as ridiculously high as that. And what we think that shows is that notwithstanding government moves towards the energy transition, gas is required now and for decades to come. It is a tool to help countries go to the energy transition, and there's no better place to be than East Asia, where that tool, in China in particular, is absolutely required to reduce the carbon intensity of the economy, which is how the Chinese are addressing the energy transition. China and Russia are talking about another gas pipeline, but those things take a long time, and that gas would come a long way. And if I was China, I'd rather deal with little old Mongolia than that a more unpredictable country to the north. Last but not least, our Gobi H2 project, we think is emerging as a world-class green hydrogen export project. We expect progress on that this year on a number of fronts, ultimately moving towards a pilot project of, say, 10 megawatts in size is what we're aiming for. And so we want to engage later on this year with potential off-takers, with the primary target being steel mills in China itself. So loads and loads happening in 2022. Hopefully that was all self-explanatory, but now really over to you, Lachlan, and over to the audience for questions.
That was excellent. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think what's very interesting is the Gobi drills. You did say it's in one of the best locations in the world for exporting green hydrogen. I know you're saying China's just right next door, but is there other factors as well of why it's in the best location?
Well, I mean, I think location is a primary thing, because to move hydrogen over any sort of long distance other than a pipeline, you've got to put on a boat. That means you need to reduce its temperature to minus 255 degrees, which is pretty close to absolute zero. That is significantly colder than the cost of liquefying, sort of the temperature of liquefying methane. And hence, as we've illustrated through that Rystad Energy research, it costs 4 times more than liquefying methane. An alternative is to turn it into a liquid chemical such as ammonia, but that's every time you convert, in effect, one product into another, it costs you capital and it costs you energy. And then if you're taking ammonia to the other end, if you have to turn it back into hydrogen, that costs you capital, that costs you energy. So again, a full ammonia conversion is going to cost a lot. Now, you can use ammonia as ammonia itself at the other end, for instance, in future electricity generation projects that could use ammonia. But if you want to turn it into hydrogen, which you'd need to do for steel, then its cost is going to be enormous. So that location is critical. And then if that location is combined with excellent wind, excellent solar, a lot of land that's not got a lot of other valuable uses, then that's what you want for a renewable project.
Yep. Excellent, excellent. We might actually jump into a few of the questions from the audience, because there are quite a few. This is from Jason. Provided we acquire drilling rigs, the drilling rigs that drill past 700 meters, is there a chance we revisit BAG and the cracker as well, due to the recent success of the Jade gas, who drew past this depth?
So Jade gas have been and are using one of those rigs I mentioned that I visited in November, which has just been imported by a guy I've known for a decade. He's a Kiwi who lives in Mongolia, very experienced driller, and we are engaging with him about potentially working with us this year. But we're still going through a tender process, which is legally mandated in the country, and so we haven't finalised that yet, and so don't want to commit to something on that point. But it's certainly feasible that we could be using that company or other ones that could revisit some sites that we went to before, whereby rig limitations meant we couldn't go as deep as we would have liked. And for instance, Bag should be one of those. But typically our work program evolves as we go through a year, as we get more information. And it's one of the great things about being 100% owners. We can do with what we want rather than consult with joint venturers, as is typically the case in the oil and gas industry.
Excellent. This one's from Paul. He said, given the largely successful share purchase plan in 2021, the large cash holdings, the project timeline was set out to expand and expedite. Is this still the plan, given the geographical advantages and ability to spend and bring in more hands?
So we have expanded, and we are expanding. Now, I suppose the rate of that expansion is maybe less than some shareholders have suggested to me that we might do. I think a number of factors about that. We don't want to do something just for the sake of doing it. We want to obviously do things with the scientific rigor. And then, of course, COVID in 2021 was an ever-moving feast, which put in place limitations on importing people and equipment, which had a real impact on how rapidly a program could be expanded. Yep. Now, having a strong balance sheet has allowed us to pursue the new business development opportunity of Gobi H2, and if other things came up in country or elsewhere that were complementary, again, having the optionality of a strong balance sheet means that we can move on things that other people can't. And so I'm sure shareholders expect us, and we do have a look at other things from time to time. But of course, our primary focus is methane and now hydrogen in southern Mongolia. Okay. And we are expanding the program this year.
Well, leading into that, we have a question from Peter. Will EXR split the hydrogen company from the EXR company, forming two separate companies on the ASX? And if so, will issue current shares? If it's successful, will they split the company, or are you going to keep it the one?
I think that the way to answer that is to say that we've got the option of doing that now. We don't have the necessity of doing it. So I think options create value for shareholders, even though we might never exercise that. But we could do that if we felt it was value adding. And we'll constantly therefore keep our eye on that possibility. If we did so, there's a number of mechanisms under which we could do it. A pro rata distribution or an IPO with preferential shareholder access to the float, etc. So we haven't decided upon anything like that, but it's great to have the option.
Okay, interesting. Is there any information from the Mongolian government regarding the proposed railway track into EXR territory? Is there any indication or information when the railway track in China will be completed as well, leading into EXR territory?
Well, I actually saw that railway, which is in our territory, when I was there in November. So there is a railway which extends from the Tavan Tolgoi mine to the Chinese border, pretty much paralleling a road which, back on one of the maps you might have seen, that isn't quite operational yet, but it should be later this year. There's another railway which goes pretty much east from Tavan Tolgoi, connecting to the historical line traditionally connecting Beijing to via Ulaanbaatar to the Trans-Siberian Railway in Russia itself. And so those rails are fairly mature now, but not quite finished yet. I mean, I suppose it's interesting to see that in the future, the locomotives there could be potential customers for methane. And we see methane-powered trains in the likes of Japan and America. And interestingly, we've now seen hydrogen-powered trains emerge too. I've seen some photos of that in China too. So those additional potential demand nodes are of interest and of note.
Yep. This one's from Patrick. He asks, has the Hazer process been considered for converting coal gas to hydrogen with carbon as a unusable waste product? Or is that a bit too technical?
I mean, I'm only somewhat familiar with Hazer. I think that they've been a pretty successful stock on the ASX for promoting a technology which in effect does that. But I haven't investigated its potential application in Mongolia. Our hydrogen focus has been green rather than other colors because, amongst other things, we think the renewable resources are fabulous. And without being quite as evangelical as Twiggy himself, we think that the customers are likely to prefer hydrogen to be as green as possible, and accordingly, that's been our focus to date.
Lovely, lovely. And we'll just do 2 more questions, and then we might wrap it up there. But do you see, this is from Steve, do you see any, foresee any issues concerning the dewatering, such as unexpectedly large volumes of water, such as the current blighting of the Queensland project?
So we measured the gas water saturation of the coals in the Nomgon subbasin, and it's indicated that they're pretty much fully saturated. That means that there should be substantially less water to produce than in some areas where there is undersaturation, such as in some of the basins in Queensland. But ultimately, the purpose of the pilot production test is to turn lab theory into reality. So we're pretty confident, but we can't be 100% confident that water won't flow stronger than we would like. But certainly, we think that it's not going to be like the multi-year dewatering that we've seen in some other places.
Excellent. This one's from Matthew. Do you expect to have an extended dewatering drawdown process with the coals that you have found so far, or is it pretty well normal?
We think it'll be normal or better because of the gas saturation being high, as I mentioned earlier. That's in the Nomgon subbasin. Obviously, we've got other basins to go to in due course, and they won't necessarily all have the same features. But certainly where we are just now, it looks pretty favourable from a dewatering point of view. Now, one thing that we are sensitive to is that producing water in a desert, you need to make sure the local community understands what you're doing. And if you can find an alternative use for it, then that should be encouraged. Now, to date, where we are, the level of salt is probably slightly too high for the water to be used for animals or for cropping. But it's not nearly as saline as some other places that we've seen in Australia, and we accordingly believe it can be managed fairly readily.
Excellent, excellent. And of course, those questions always come up about share price. What are your thoughts at the moment?
I suppose I'll point to the macro environment whereby there's been a technical correction in the overall market, and for stocks which are presumed to be at the riskier end, and a resource exploration company in a foreign country tends to be characterized that way, is going to suffer from a general bearish trend in the market. I think as we go into this year's program on both gases, that all things being equal, there is a chance of significant share price appreciation. But hey, I'm the MD, it's my job to say that. That's not financial advice. But hopefully what I've said today would support that. And then ultimately, the key issue for resource stocks, are you come issue because you need money, is not present for us for a number of years. We have a very strong balance sheet. We can more than pursue all our current projects and more if it came to that. And so dilution is not going to be an issue unless one chooses to sell. You're not going to be forced into a dilution scenario. So, you know, we see macro issues, we see company-specific issues, but we think that we've got a pretty good program to bring back the halcyon days of higher share prices in the not too distant future.
Lovely, lovely. Well, I do have to thank you. You put up a really good presentation today. I'm sure the investors are very happy with how you presented today. From Port Jackson Securities side, thank you for coming back and doing another webinar with us. Is there any final comments you want us to lead into 2022 with?
Well, obviously, firstly, thanks to you and thanks to the audience for dialing in. And I think, as some of you might know me, and you can contact me in various ways. You've got particular queries. I suppose the message for 2022, it's now a tale of two gases. Hydrogen is emerging as, I think, a potentially world-class asset for Elixir here. That's not to take our eye off the methane ball. The two rest on the same fundamentals of proximity to market and working in a country that we've got a pretty firm foundation in.
Lovely, lovely. Well, thank you once again, everyone. This will be up on our website later, so if you didn't quite hear something or want to rewatch it again, you can watch it from there. Apart from that, my name is Lachlan Callahan from Port Jackson Securities, and thank you once again for having us and attending the webinar today. See you next time.
Thanks. See ya.